Can you hear me now? No? How are we going? Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you, Neil. And what I'd like to talk about really is the milk fat globular membrane, but just putting things into perspective. It's hard to say that after a cup of coffee. Is really to try and sort of tie it all together. We've heard two beautiful presentations earlier this morning, and in particular with Regini, Dr. Regini, sort of talking about the role of emotional intelligence. And I have to confess that I've now had the privilege of being sharing the platform with Regini on, this is now my third occasion, and I've learned something each time. And when I first heard Regini talking, I was a real sceptic with respect, because within the company, the marketeers were talking about IQ and EQ, and as a paediatric gastroenterologist, and works with poo and everything, I thought EQ was a made-up term. I really thought this was something that the marketeers had invented to sort of make this thing. So when Regini this was in Malaysia last year, talked about EQ, I was, wow. This actually, A, it's real, and B, it's so important. And when you start thinking about the whole spectrum of what we are, I was just saying this to someone before, we always talk about people being intelligent, but not very smart. And I think that's a way of looking at it too. And your screen time, the daytime TV, maybe think of Donald Trump. And, the man who lives and dies by Fox News, maybe there's an explanation. Maybe he's been pre-programmed in this regard, and it's started back from infancy. Who knows? The other thing I'd like to sort of focus on, as it's a very sensitive button, the whole spectrum of the microbiome, the microbiota gut-brain axis, and I'm going to focus on the gut microbiome, but as we're knowing now, that every body surface, every body cavity and others have got the innate special microbiota. And we're just starting to learn about the role, and I'll expand upon this directly, but really we're starting to learn about this. I sat on an Australian NIH equivalent, the National Health and Medical Research Council Centres of Research Excellent panel a couple of years ago. So these were the finalists to get CREs from across the leading researchers in the country, looking for 5-year grants of many millions of dollars. And there was oncology papers, there was social impact papers or projects, there was a whole spectrum of applications. And there were two common threads to all of those applications. One was they all had a health economics perspective, and they all had a microbiota or microbiome perspective. So that you can't read the literature. So we're starting to fall apart here, aren't we? Who's going to be the last man standing? I saw Regina almost fell through the floor. So it's interesting. But the microbiome has, and what's also interesting too, I still see patients, and in my day-to-day practice, or it's less than day-to-day, but when I'm talking to mothers and grandmothers, etc., it's interestingly though, every one of them understands the microbiome. The lay press has really sort of got, they may not know much about it, but it's a concept that they understand. And what we're now trying to do is, in fact, it is such a complex ecosystem of communications both ways. And I think many of us went to a presentation about the autonomic nervous system and the enteric nervous system in Glasgow earlier in the year, and the complexities of those communications and intercommunications is really quite astounding. And again, as a humble gastroenterologist, I'm just blown away by the science that's coming from this. And but we really, there's the usual sort of culprits of what's happening within the gut. But what's exciting to me, and we'll hear a little about this tomorrow from Roberto Berni-Canani, I hope, about the beyond the gut experiences, the things, the effect on inflammatory processes, the effect on autism and attention deficit disorders, the effect on cardiovascular disease, the effect on stroke prevention, and things like this. It's really quite astounding, and it's almost too good to be true. When you start talking about these things to people, they look at you and say, this is just this is too much. But I've seen the data, I've read the literature, and it's really quite extraordinary what's happening with the microbiome. And I think we're at the very beginning stages of understanding. I think if we had this conversation in maybe 5 years' time, certainly in 10 years' time, we'll look back and say, God, you were primitive back then. And we'll be really having a whole different spectrum of how we approach the process. But it's a complex process and involves a number of issues, and it raises the spectrum, as Roberto will talk tomorrow about the concept. The new thing I could talk about to parents is the role of postbiotics. And the postbiotic is a really interesting thing. I won't steal Roberto's thunder, but I find this the most exciting thing that we are dealing with now within my area of expertise and specialty, and I think that's the future, and you'll hear about this tomorrow. What the whole purpose of this, and this is again to me part of the interesting sort of concept. When I first joined the company 3.5 years ago, my first day, I sat in my office, had no idea what I was doing, what I was going to do. There was no induction. It was just there. I was sitting there, nice view over the Singapore harbour, and I was told within the first hour, we want you to give a presentation about MFGM to our new advertiser, their annual visit for the advertising agents. I said, what? So I was thrown into the deep end, and I really started looking into this, and I've been fascinated by the concept, the science behind milk fat globule membrane. So MFGM so what it basically is if you look at this sort of process, but it starts off life within the cytosol of the breast lacteal, or the duct. The cell, and around the endoplasmic reticulum. So we always used to think that what MFGM was doing was actually acting as an emulsifying agent. You all know that when you put oil and water together, it never goes into suspension without emulsification. So we've always thought that milk fat globule membrane was in fact the emulsifying agent for breast milk. Now that was its primary function, was to keep the fat in solution, because within this, this is where the triglycerols, the complex fats, are surrounded, and they start off life that way. And this is what was happening. It was always thought that, in fact, the infant formula business, that we had better emulsifying agents. We didn't sell membrane, or a single layer membrane from the endoplasmic reticulum. It then further goes into the system with the globule becoming larger, and is then extruded into the lacteal, into the duct, with 2 further layers. So it becomes a tri-layer. So 3 layers of membrane around this fat globule. Hence the name milk fat globule membrane. There's nothing smart about this. And that's where it started. That's where we all stopped. We had other emulsifying agents. We didn't need to use this sort of process. Didn't serve any other purpose. But what has been found is that there is a multitude of both complex milk lipids and bioactive proteins as part of this layer, or these layers. And at the last count, for instance, there's in excess of 200 bioactive proteins in these lipid layers, and it's rich in phospholipids, sphingomyelin, gangliosides, and other active complex milk lipids there. So there's this real package of activity, bioactivity within this sort of these membranes. It's been shown in many studies that in fact this is it's resistant to gastric acid breakdown, so it goes through the stomach acids, and it's been shown to be able to then liberate. It breaks down and is able to liberate the contents into the circulation, so you can measure many of these substances in the circulation accordingly. Now, where it becomes complicated is that there is no one test for MFGM, if you will. You can't. There's no measurement of MFGM because it's such a complex process, and in excess of 200 things that you can do. And so, we and others in the human milk world use sphingomyelin as a sort of de facto measurement in that regard. But of the proteins, we still don't know what half of them are. We still don't know what they do. But I think what's becoming very apparent to me is, in fact, that this MFGM is more than just the sum of the parts. That 1 + 1 does not equal 2, but it probably equals 3 or 4. It's a very complex interaction process that's going there. And what's also, I think, really interesting is that with MFGM, again, many will know that there's been, since when DHA and arachidonic acid became very prevalent in the literature and usage in infant formula and the knowledge in human milk, there's been whole debates about how much you should put in, what the ratio should be, what they do, and there's been, in the last 20 years, there's been countless articles about this, and there's no agreement within the learned societies and the regulatory bodies about what those ratios should be and what those concentrations should be. There's a list of about 10 different sort of recommended guidelines. The nice thing about MFGM is that nature has decided what's there, nature has decided how much they should be there, and nature delivers it. So it's a natural product, if you will, which is an interesting concept. Now, yes, when it's been used in infant formula, it's a bovine source, and there's about an 85% homology between bovine MFGM and breast human milk MFGM. The biggest difference, this is fascinating, one of the biggest differences in one of the gangliosides, which has been shown that, and I can never remember the numbers, but one of the ganglioside pairs, that when it gets into the circulation, into the baby, in fact the baby reverts it back to the human milk style ratio. So there's very, very little difference between the two, human milk MFGM and the bovine. In fact, every mammalian species, their milks contain MFGM in different sort of concentrations and different sort of processes, whether it be goat, yak, buffalo milk, they all contain MFGM. So it's a very important sort of concept to the complexities of breast milk and human milk. So what I'd like to share with you is some of this is not by no means is it a complete list of things, and in the interest of time, I've deliberately taken out the myriad of experimental in vitro sort of studies, but really sort of to talk about some of the leading clinical studies that have come through. Now, the first one is done by Gunita, and this was done using a complex milk lipid from a company from New Zealand, and this was done in Indonesia. And Gunita showed, and this was the tests were done using Griffith studies or Griffith scales, and they showed in this that there was the addition of milk fat globule membrane to the diets into the milk that was given to these infants, that in fact, and these infants were just given from up until 6 months of age, that they in fact showed an increase of improved cognitive scores, in general score, performance scores, and in hand-eye coordination in these infants going. So that was back in 2012. An important study was done by a group from Umeå in Sweden in 2014. This is the so-called TIMBY study, and I'll talk about this again, an extension in a moment, but the TIMBY study again showed a group of infants given in Umeå, and Umeå is an interesting sort of place within Sweden. It's a very controlled environment. They do a lot of studies there, so the compliance rates are very good, and they've been doing this many years. And this was a group led by Bo Lunnedal and Ollie Hernell, who really are at the forefront of human nutrition research. This was independent research, and they showed, using a breast milk control, that in fact the addition of MFGM to these infants in comparison to breast milk and to a DHA-containing sort of control formula, that there was an improvement in cognitive scores of about 4 points, which, if you think back to the literature, that when DHA was first sort of mooted in the DHA story, there was a 4-point addition or so of DHA adding to the performance and the scores of these infants, but there was still a gap between what you could see with formula in comparison to human milk. And there's always this gap. And so the TIMBY study showed that, again, the addition of MFGM did in fact close that gap to a non-significant sort of status. And that was in the realms where we're looking at IQ. What we're now showing, I think, and this is a study, and I'll show you 2 studies which are showing you, which I think is actually looking now at, and there's probably, if you think back to the IQ things, it's probably because of the additions of extra sphingomyelin gangliosides and all the complex milk lipids that are going there, going directly to helping with myelination, helping with nerve conduction, things like that. And as we saw with Regina, the plasticity, helping those synaptic connections. And there's some experimental data in isolated rat cell models that the addition of sphingomyelin to the cell culture medium, in fact, enhances nerve conduction and enhances synaptogenesis, if you will. The first study, again back in 2012, perhaps looking at emotional intelligence, was done by Geoffrey and Waters in Belgium. And she showed, and this was an older cohort of patients looking at the addition of MFGM to infants, between the ages of 2 and 6, and then did looked at a couple of things, but one of them was looking at a questionnaire of looking at behavioural regulation, both to the parents and it was given to the school teachers. The school teachers showed no difference. There was no difference between them, but in the adults, the parents, showed an improvement both of emotional and behavioural regulation, which I think is the first hint that we are in fact looking at this from an emotional intelligence perspective. And this was done, again, if you remember Rajini's slide showing it starts off at around 7, 8 months of age. This was done at between 2 and 4 years, so it's down the track a bit. And I'll show you some data in a moment which actually reinforces this. But it reminds me of what we also saw years ago. In another lifetime, I was involved in an iron panel in Australia and looking at the iron research there, that a similar sort of process was looked at. If you take babies who were iron deficient, had iron deficiency anemia, at the age of between 9 months and 12 months of age, and then you then looked at them and went into this sort of the kindergarten performance, even though their anemia was corrected at that time, they had this little window of iron deficiency anemia that these children would describe. If you look at a group of kids in the kindergarten, there'd be one or two children who were hiding behind the mother's skirts, not wanting to go out and explore. They're the sort of the introverted, not really sort of wanting to explore. They were the ones who had iron deficiency anemia in that infancy period. So again, I think it's probably circumstantially looking at what Regina was talking about, emotional control and those sort of effects. So it's a really, just to reinforce what Virginia was saying, it's a profound time in that first year of life and from conception through to delivery. So this first 1,000 days, we have so much to do to look at, and we're just scratching the surface of our understanding in that regard. I think it's very exciting times coming ahead for us to sort of look at the process. But this is the Veerman water study. Now, what I'd like to share with you is one which is in press. This is from China, and the Journal of Paediatrics any day now. It's been in press now for a while. We're just waiting for it to start. I keep on monitoring the Journal of Paediatrics website on a daily basis to see when we can actually sort of talk about it more. So this was a study a little different from the TIMBY study, which looked at the addition of both MFGM and lactoferrin to infants from 2 weeks of age and right through till 12 months of age. So it was given for a longer period of time. So just remind you that the other studies looked at for up until 6 months of age and then went on to their normal breastfed or whatever diets they were getting. So this was looked at from 2 weeks of age through to 1 year of age, and they had a number of different sort of studies. So they had this ages and stages questionnaire given at 4 months, 6 months and 9 months, and the ages and stages questionnaire looks at communication, problem solving, gross motor, fine motor function, and in particular personal and social skills. And that's about all I understand about it. Virginia could sort of correct me and talk about the names of these things, escape me on occasion, but this is one, and they did show that there was significantly higher scores in this ages and stages, in particular at 4 and 9 months of age across all 5 measures. They also did a Bailey's test 3 at 12 months of age, which is quite early in the developmental sort of processes to do Bailey's, and again at 18 months of age, plus the MacArthur-Bates Communication Developmental Indice, or the CDI, and a single object-free play study. Now, the single object-free and the MacArthur-Bailey test looks at, so the single object-free study is really looking at attention. And effectively what you do is, if you sort of have, put a block or something on a table, the baby's looking at it and playing with it, and if you cover it over, out of sight, out of mind. They just look at something else. Whereas the ability to start looking for it is a developmental milestone in that regard. And I think that's, if I interpret what I'm hearing from Virginia over the last sort of year about hearing her conversations, is that this is a way of looking at you getting more sustained attention, more meaningful attention, which helps with the development of the plasticity to the development of the babies. And I looked at this, I started looking at this when I was in the iron sort of spectrum, so I had to teach myself some developmental sort of neuroscience, if you will, and I sort of interpret this as being, as Virginia was saying, when a baby is first born, their field of view and field of vision is this. They're looking up, they get the occasional, if they might have a mobile there to look at, they get a parental face suddenly appearing over the cot randomly. So when they start to they then get head control, they get more inputs and more things, and so it goes on with the sort of sitting, standing, more and more visual and auditory inputs coming into their being. They can then process this to develop whatever the emotional controls and things that we're seeing. The other things which were, and so there was this enhancement of this single object free play and sustained attention. The other thing which to me is exciting is really been what we see with language. And these were looking at, there was a significant improvement in language scores at 12 months of age, particularly with sentence complexities occurring across the age, and I'll expand upon this in a moment. Interestingly, and I'm not going to show the data, but the control group were, this is an interesting sort of subset. The control group were in fact had higher than normal scores as well. They were above average in their scores. And you could say, well, why? But the experimental group were much higher. But you ask them, why is this control group doing so well? And it turned out that the population where this came from, it was in a region called Hefei in central China, where it was the process there was in fact that both parents, they would plan the pregnancy, but both parents worked outside the city. They would go off and they would come back maybe once every 6 months or so. So the caregivers were the grandparents. And these grandparents probably spent more time with this baby than the parents would have, who may have been working in town. So these children were being nurtured in a more loving environment. This is my interpretation of things as why this could possibly be to say we're seeing a higher level in the control group. So we talk about, and I'm now very much in the genre of talking about so what, and what does all this mean? I can show you countless slides, countless sort of graphs, scatter graphs, bar graphs, all sorts of things showing all the things. But to your perspective, so what? What does it mean? What does it mean to the parents of these children? So I've tried to put it in a sort of a sequence of events about the so what. So adding MFGM to infant formula has given an IQ enhancement of four IQ points, so we could say it enhances cognition. And the studies of Timby and Ganita, Tanaka I didn't show. Tanaka was looking at very low birth weights from Japan, very low birth weight infants showing similar increases of cognitive performance. So we see an enhanced cognition. So what? What does that mean to the average person in the street? So this study from China, another one I didn't show you was from Spain, showing that there is an acceleration of cognitive and language and motor development. So this learning is faster. Interestingly, in the Lee study, by 18 months, the differences have disappeared. But the experimental group got there first. And they had 6 months in advance of this enhanced cognition. They all caught up, they all got there, but the group got there faster. So what does that mean? So is have an enhanced cognition? Does it make a difference? Does 6 months make a difference? And I think this is an interesting sort of thing, is that in fact, Marchman and Fernald in developmental science are completely unrelated to MFGM and things, came out and said that measures of spoken language, processing and vocabulary knowledge at 25 months, so 2 years of age, strongly predicts the performance of measures of school-age performance, language and cognitive skills, and these links really involve working memory. So what it's showing to me is, in fact, again, my simplistic view is that if you get there faster, you have a leg up in the situation. Your potential performance is going to be enhanced. And this is happening in that very critical time, as Regina was saying, the emotional control, etc., in that second 6 months of life and beyond. So this is, I think, very, very powerful, to me, a powerful initial work in this regard. So that's what we see in this. But MFGM is not a one-trick pony. As I said, it's more than just the sum of the parts. And what I'd like to do is now sort of change tack, if you will, and talk about its role in infection and immunity, which when I'm talking to doctors and parents and mothers, they all get that we're all looking at trying to sort of enhance brain development and sort of really give a good start. But they don't really, they understand it, but they don't really care because it's way off in the future. And that's not having an impact on their day-to-day sort of functionality, particularly from the doctor's perspective. They want something which is going to impact on their day-to-day practice, if you will, so they can see a difference. So this is where I think this is important. Again, this is very much involved in the microbiome. So again, we're getting back to that commonality space. The Timby in the same group from Umeå, Sweden in 2014 also looked at otitis media, and I'll expand on this in a moment. But in fact, this is to me, a very powerful study in this regard. But the VM and Waters group, the one that looked at the behavioural regulation, also showed the children given MFGM, there was a reduction in days of fever. If your fever is reduced and so less severe and less frequent, your visits to the doctor are going to be less. The time away from work for the parents is going to be less. But also more importantly, there will be fewer prescriptions of antibiotics. And we all know, and Roberto will attest on this tomorrow, in fact, antibiotics in the first year of life is bad for the microbiome. And a single course of antibiotics, in fact, changes the microbiome and really sets people up for food allergy and the consequences of the atopic march. So stopping the need for this, I think, is a very powerful observation. The Zavaleta group from South America showed a reduction in bacterial diarrhoea. There's also been some work which has shown an enhancement of rotavirus vaccine with the addition of MFGM. And all the groups showed, so the Lee study showed a reduction in gastrointestinal events and diarrhoea, and also an enhancement against protection against respiratory events, upper respiratory infections and cough. So we're changing both the guts milieu about infection, but also the respiratory infection. So again, these are all good things that the practitioners at the coalface can see and get that it's making a difference to their daily practice. But let me just give you the one example about otitis media. Now, babies don't present to the emergency room with parents saying, my baby has got otitis media. They usually present with a high fever, screaming pain, usually at 2 o'clock in the morning, often with a febrile convulsion, panic parents. The doctor's been dragged out of bed to go and see this baby, so no one's happy. And it's always been expected or understood that breastfed babies do not get otitis media in the first year of life. It's one of the advantages of breast milk. And why is this the case? And before the study came out, we were just to argue, well, maybe there's something to do with the way that the difference between sucking at the nipple and sucking in the bottle. Maybe there's some eustachian tube dynamics that we don't know and understand, but that was our sort of simplistic view of how to try and explain this observation that bottle-fed babies get otitis media, breastfed babies don't. This study from Tinby, in fact, showed that the addition of MFGM also protected against otitis media. Now, what's important is that they didn't leave it at that, because we would have been left hanging. Why is this the case? And what's happened? So clearly, it's nothing to do with the way they suck at the teat and the bottle, because they're doing the same thing. So what they did look at was the oral microbiome, and this is, to me, is fascinating. So if you look at this roll here, and you don't need these things are irrelevant, but here there was a difference with the Moraxella species. And Moraxella has been known to cause otitis media, bronchiolitis, and laryngitis. So this is an initial study which is showing that the contact of MFGM just through suckling, just through the bottle, the contact in the mouth, in fact, has changed the microbiome in the mouth, which I think is a fascinating sort of observation in that regard. Now this is another, which is just to put in perspective, I was saying before about the microbiota, that every body surface has got a microbiome and every body cavity has. The one microbiome that seems to be very, very important during pregnancy is the placental microbiome. So the placenta is not sterile, amniotic fluid is not sterile. There's a microbiome there. And the placental microbiome seems to control the duration of pregnancy and also birth weight. Now you would imagine that the most closely associated microbiome, the placental microbiome, should be the vaginal microbiome. That is not the case. The one which is most closely associated with the placental microbiome is in fact the oral microbiome. How this, and they think that the communication between the two is via the bloodstream. So hematogenous communication between the oral microbiome and the placental microbiome, and I think this is via exosomes. But that's just this hypothesis at the moment, but I think this is where we're going. There's this communication between the two. And the oral microbiome in that relationship, and sort of digressing, but this is coming to the obstetricians in the audience, is that it's been well described in the United Kingdom that there's an association between dental caries and prematurity. That was left hanging there. If you had bad teeth, you had premature babies. Probably because of the oral microbiome. Again, the hypothesis, but I think it's you can try and talk me out of it, but good luck. It makes sense to me in that regard. Now, just sort of finishing up in this is now looking at the role of, and expanding what Regina was just talking about, is really looking at the role of the emotional intelligence and EQ on longer lifetime sort of performance and acquisitions. It was all, and the social scientists, I've been reading this literature and it's quite fascinating, but if you look at the social science literature, it was always thought that if you had money, you were happy. That was the old paradigm. That's been flipped around now, that if you're happy, you make money. And that's all the reasons that Regina was talking about, sort of the ability to talk, negotiate, emotional control. And there's now been there's been 3 or 4 studies which is looking at this. This is just one from Brazil, which is showing, this is on breastfeeding, but in fact that if you were breastfed and you had this enhanced emotional intelligence, that you could directly result this to future income and future income earnings. So this is a very powerful sort of story if you start thinking about it. If what you're doing during pregnancy and in the first sort of year or 2 of life can actually have a dramatic impact on what you're going to do for the rest of your life, wow, we are really at the cutting edge of really sort of transforming social society, if you will, in that regard. And this is all through emotional intelligence. So what I'd just like to finish with is I think this is the goal we have, and we're seeing with MFGM and other attentions that if you can enhance school-age language and cognitive ability, so the IQ, you can enhance now emotional intelligence with EQ, you can enhance income and enhanced happiness. The central role is a very contented, happy child. But I put here too the reduction in morbidity. And this has a huge impact, if you will, because if you know, we say you reduce otitis media. But what does recurrent otitis media do? It gives you chronic serious otitis media. What does it do? It gives you language, hearing deficits. They're the kids who sit at the front of the class and who don't perform as well. Parents have to take time off work every time. So if you're reducing that, you're reducing respiratory infection, you're reducing a whole bunch of other things, you're reducing morbidity. And that has significant impact on this thing. So with that, I'd like to sort of finish and just